you'll have that coming to you at the end of the week. I also want to mention that we want to make sure we put questions in the chat. And we encourage lots of questions for Wesley. Let's try and stump our expert. And with that, we'll get started here. I guess I'll introduce Wesley. We're at 3 minutes after. So Wesley Snell is, for those of you who hadn't been here before, is with a company called Etifor in Italy. They are a purveyor or a environmental consulting company, you should call them, with an expertise around ecosystem services and the ecosystem services verified impact procedure with FSC. Wesley was also a member of the working group that developed the latest revision of the FSC ecosystem services procedure that was just published in January of this year. So I'll let Wesley do more introductions on himself, but he is from North Carolina. So I want to give him a shout out. His hometown's like 60 miles from me. So we're glad to have Wesley with us, and we're glad to hear him to share his expertise with us on this topic. So Wesley, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. And good to see y'all. Good to see everyone who I see some familiar names who've been here in the last couple of sessions. So thanks for making it to the final stretch, and welcome to anyone who hasn't attended so far. I hope that I can give enough context for it to make sense. I think I'll just dive right in because I'm going to introduce myself and my organization briefly at the beginning of today's session. My guess is that I'm going to spend less time on some of the review that we did from the last couple of sessions. And so we might have a little more time at the end for the Q&A, or we can buy back a little bit of time at the end for everyone to carry on with your work day. So anyway, without further ado, let me just get the presentation up. And I'm in presentation. Okay, are we good? We're in presentation mode. Everyone can see my screen. I'll take the silence as a yes. I see a thumbs up from Tom. Okay, great. Okay, so today is the last of the three-part series. We're going to be talking more about the role of sponsors in verified impact. So what are the requirements for sponsors in the ecosystem service procedure? What are the functions of an ecosystem services claim that's verified by FSC? What it can be used for, and where it can fit into corporate climate and nature positive strategies. So just a quick overview. I'm going to give a quick introduction that probably several of you have heard me do before. So I'm going to try to move quickly through that. And then I'm going to set the scene around what are the best practices around the responsible use of nature-based solutions claims. So whether you're supporting or generating positive impacts for carbon, biodiversity, water, etc. There are certain ground rules, let's say, that we'll go over depending on what kind of claim you're trying to support and where it takes place vis-a-vis your direct operations or value chain. And then I'm going to provide an overview of FSC verified impact. And I'm going to go a little more into the mechanics of how impact claims work for sponsors and how it's governed under the procedure. And then, as always, we'll leave some time for a good, healthy Q&A at the end. Just a quick introduction. So as Tom said, I'm from North Carolina. I grew up in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina for most of my life, but I'm currently living in Padova, Italy. It's located in the northeast of Italy, about 20 minutes outside Venice. And I work for an organization called Etifor. Etifor is a spin-off consulting firm of the University of Padova. It was founded about 11 years ago by a group of former professors and entrepreneurs. And in a sentence or in a nutshell, at Etifor, our mission is to put nature at the heart of decision-making through science-based solutions. And we do this we cover a lot of ground and a lot of different topics, from tourism and local development to advisory services for corporates and financial institutions. We have really strong backgrounds that cover economic, environmental, and social benefits, especially for nature-based solutions projects at local, regional, national, and international scales. Really covers a wide gambit. And we have a lot of experience working both, let's say, the public side, public sector side. So working with everything from local municipalities to the European Commission, to the United States government, to the Kingdom of Thailand, etc. So around results-based payment structures or fund structures for nature, as well as working with private companies to help them develop climate and nature strategies, set science-based targets, and then implement those strategies, hopefully for everyone's benefit. We have projects all over the world, so we work very, very broadly. We've worked with over 1,000 different business clients, everything from very small local enterprises. I think a few years ago we did a project with the local dentist, all the way up to multinational corporates, and some of the household consumer product names, which I am bound not to disclose publicly, and don't anyway as a best practice, but that I'm sure everyone would be familiar with. And like I said, we've done really a very broad range of projects that have given us a lot of experience, especially in the forest sector space. As most of you know, and as Tom alluded to, this is the third of a three-part webinar series that we've been carrying out following the release of the revised version 2 of the Ecosystem Services Procedure and the rebranding of FSC's Verified Impact. So the first session, which was really aimed at a general audience, was really aiming at the fundamentals of why it's important to invest in responsible forest management for ecosystem services, for the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, et cetera. So there we really went into what is nature-related financial risk, what are the major impacts that we're seeing globally, and how does that impact our economic institutions? What are the global and regional policy responses? So covering things like the Paris Agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, at a multilateral level, all the way down to specific policy responses from the SEC in the United States and California's Climate Accountability Package, as well as emerging nature-related disclosure frameworks in Europe. So that was really for a general audience, and just to cover, why are we talking about verified impact? Where does it fit into this nature-related assessment, management, and disclosure space? The second session was aimed primarily at certificate holders, forest owners, forest managers, project developers, and it covered the revision of the Ecosystem Service Procedure and Verified Impact in a more operational way. So what are the nuts and bolts of how to actually apply the procedure? What are the 7 steps? How to develop a theory of change, and how to measure and report outcomes. This session covers sponsorships, and our main target audience here is forest product retailers, forest adjacent companies, or companies that have a material dependence on forest products, investors, financial institutions, etc. And here, what we're going to try to talk about and explore are, what are the quality and integrity criteria that we need for the responsible use of impact claims, whether that's a carbon credit or a verified impact claim, etc. What are the rules around value chain engagement, as well as making net zero, climate neutral, or nature positive claims, and how that relates to verified impact under FSC. So I thought it would be useful just to lay the groundwork here around responsible use. There's been a lot of discussion about this, especially in the last couple of years. We've seen a lot of disruptions in nature markets around carbon credits, for example, about what makes a good project and how can the impacts that are generated by that project be credibly and responsibly used toward global or corporate specific climate targets. So we can just dive right into that. So when we talk about what is the responsible use of impact claims, and here I'm really speaking quite generally. So this is very relevant for the ecosystem service procedure and verified impact. But really, when I'm working with companies or financial institutions or governments for that matter, on how do we build a good project, and then how do we maximize the value of that project, we're really talking about the intersection of two really important sets of criteria. And these are often divided by quality criteria for the project itself. So what criteria need to be in place in order to credibly demonstrate that a positive impact has actually occurred, that it's real, it's measurable, it's durable, etc. And there's been a lot of focus on that. And often when we talk about standards, carbon crediting or verified impact, et cetera, a lot of the attention is on the quality criteria. So how do we demonstrate the additionality of this project, its permanence? Is it third party verified or second party, or are they certifying themselves? What sort of assurance systems are in place? What methodologies were used to quantify the impact? Are they credible, replicable, conservative, et cetera? Are they accurate? Is the accounting really covering the full impact of the project? Are we seeing externalized impacts or leakage from the project? Do we see trade-offs within the project between, let's say, carbon removal benefits, but maybe at the expense of, say, water availability or biodiversity integrity? These are all of the questions that go into evaluating the quality of a project. These are the things that land managers, for forest managers, for this particular conversation, those are the things that are the hard work that's done by project developers and land managers in order to put together not only a good project, but a good product that they can bring to market. And we've seen a lot of work done recently from the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, and especially the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, ICVCM, that are really setting very clear rules around what these quality criteria should be and what are the exact bounds of what makes a good project and what doesn't. And outside the voluntary space, we're also seeing this legislated or in policy responses in the European Union. They're releasing the carbon removal certification framework, which is a EU level sort of standard of standards that sets the rules on what are the quality criteria that need to be in place to demonstrate a positive impact. So this was covered mainly in session 2, also a little bit in session 1. I talked a lot about how the procedure works and what is the process for demonstrating this impact. And during the revision of the procedure, there were a lot of upgrades. Upgrades is one word. A lot of revisions that were put in place to make sure that the procedure is aligned with these benchmarks, these best practices, and what's widely agreed to be the important quality criteria. And that's very important if you're a sponsor and you're evaluating a project. And any sponsor, I think anybody who's procuring or sponsoring or allocating a significant amount of capital toward projects needs to have their own system in place to evaluate what makes a quality project for them, right? On the other side, we have the integrity criteria. And this is something that gets a little less attention, or maybe a better way to say it is the attention is often placed in a different conversation. And this is around what should companies be doing to mitigate their impacts on carbon emissions, to contribute toward the fight against the climate crisis or nature loss, or etc. And for the purposes of this presentation, what we're really going to be talking about is what is the role of project level nature-based solutions within an overall corporate climate plan. And when I'm working with organizations, they often want to jump very quickly to supporting positive impacts on the ground. And I understand the appeal of that. Companies often, these projects on the ground have real, tangible, visible benefits. You can see the change taking place, which is very communicable. It's easy for them to share with their stakeholders. But we always are very clear that any support for these impacts need to take place within a much broader engagement with how a company understands its impacts and manages them. So for example, these integrity criteria at a company level are things like having an organization-wide climate commitment. So something that's Paris Agreement aligned, or net zero by 2050 aligned with what the US government or the United Nations or the European Union, et cetera, have all said as what is needed from the private sector in order for us to reach our net zero targets. So there needs to be an organization-wide commitment. There need to be science-based targets. And Science-Based Targets Initiative, for example, has done really a lot of incredible work in helping organizations understand at a corporate level, at a sector level, how to set those targets. The company needs to have a clear strategy for meeting these targets that's aligned with the mitigation hierarchy. I'm going to talk more specifically about that in just a moment. And then, like these projects on the ground, these commitments, these targets, this strategy, it needs to be transparent, publicly available, and in most cases, and especially for large organizations, third-party verified. And there needs to be a clear prioritization framework for how they engage, especially within their value chain. So my point here being that anytime we talk about why it's not only why it's important for companies or financial institutions or sponsors to support these projects, it's also how they should be supporting them is really important. And this is where we see this these responsible use criteria, both on the quality side, the supply side, and on the demand side, with these integrity criteria. And generally, when we're talking about integrity criteria, it really revolves around the mitigation hierarchy. So whether we're talking about a biodiversity strategy and a net gain biodiversity plan, or a climate strategy, net zero by 2050, or climate neutral by 2030, typically speaking, when companies are laying out how they're going to reach these targets, it's really important that they can show that they're adhering to the mitigation hierarchy. The mitigation hierarchy is a prioritization framework for addressing negative environmental impacts. And it proceeds in a very stepwise way to show how companies are, one, measuring their impact, and then what steps are they taking first to avoid the impacts that they can, and then to minimize the impacts that they can't avoid, and then to restore or remediate impacts that they can't avoid or reduce. And then finally, in order to, sort of get that last dangling bit of impact that they can't avoid, minimize, or restore, what can they offset in order to reach a net zero or no net loss target? And how can they go even further to reach a net gain or a climate positive target through voluntary contributions? And anytime an organization is disclosing their climate strategy, whether it's through CDP or the new ISSB standard, the TCFD, the SEC requirements, any one of these, pull a name out of the alphabet soup. And when they ask to explain the strategy, it's really important to frame it in terms of this mitigation hierarchy to show that you're prioritizing the activities to avoid and minimize before you go straight to offsetting or contributions to show. And it's a very important piece of this puzzle, and one that figures actually quite prominently in the ecosystem service procedure as one of its key integrity criteria for sponsors. Now, on the supply side, it gets a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to try to spend a good amount of time explaining these key differences and what do we mean when we talk about verified impacts on the supply side. I typically like to categorize this into two main types of positive impacts or verified impacts. And those are either actions to abate your impacts, so avoid or minimize your impacts within your value chain, or actions to offset or contribute positive impacts beyond your value chain. And on the right here, it's a graphic, maybe quite a lot of lines, but don't be intimidated by it. So the idea is that under a nature positive strategy or a net zero strategy, when we're talking about a company, they kind of had two choices in where they allocate how much funding or capital they have available toward their strategy. And on the one side, they can look at abatement within their value chain. So looking upstream toward their suppliers, especially to what are the actions I can take, or what are the actions that my suppliers can take and that I can support so that they can avoid or minimize or restore where necessary climate emissions or land use conversion or biodiversity loss, water consumption, etc. Right? And on the other side, where say a company would rather engage with nearby communities, so maybe not stakeholders that they're connected with in an economic or business sense, but in their local landscapes or in their local communities, or in projects that they find to be highly charismatic or communicable, they can look beyond their supply chain. And here they're typically looking to make a claim about either offsetting their emissions or their biodiversity impacts, or a broader and more philanthropic contribution of positive impacts. And here they're typically either engaging directly with local forest managers or others in their local community, or they're going through brokers or consultants. I do this work all the time, for example, to help connect these companies with projects all over the world. Now, what's really important when we talk about the quality criteria differences between these two types of positive impact sponsorship is that the quality criteria can change depending on whether you're engaging within your value chain or outside of it. Okay. So if we're talking about, I'll take the more common example. If we're talking about beyond value chain mitigation, so offsetting or contributions, the quality criteria that are necessary in order to make an offsetting claim, for example, is you need to show very clear legal, financial, and impact additionality. So the company, it's really important that the finance, the attribution of the impact is directly related to the financial sponsorship of the impact, that the impact would not have been possible under a business as usual scenario without the financial support from the company. There are also much stricter requirements in terms of permanence, in terms of establishing a counterfactual baseline scenario. So what would happen in this project area if we did nothing? And it can be really quite complicated and fairly uncertain, although there's been a lot of great work done in the last few years to bolster the quality of these additionality and permanence and counterfactual scenario modeling. On the other side, when we talk about within value chain abatement, there's some of these requirements really don't apply. So for example, it's not necessary to show the additionality of the project when we're talking about engagement within a supply chain. It's typically has much less to do with permanent projects where you have 30 or 40-year contracts, and more important to have annual impact monitoring and reporting, because these impacts are integrated within, say, Scope 3 emissions accounting, or upstream biodiversity impact monitoring. So in these cases, it's less important to have these sort of carbon crediting project requirements, additionality, permanence. It's more important to have traceability, for one thing. So you need to actually be able to show that the forest managers upstream that you're supporting are actually inside your supply chain, and segregate which part of your supply chain you're engaging with, which one you're not engaging with, which one you can't trace, etc. So there's a lot more work there on traceability and supply chain segregation. But so there are some very key differences depending on where you're engaging and where you're choosing to allocate your funds for sponsorship, and then some which are shared. So in either case, the impact will obviously need to be accurately and conservatively quantified. That doesn't change whether you're engaging upstream or outside your value chain. Okay, I hope that makes sense. It's a pretty important common understanding for us to keep going. But we do have time at the end for questions if you have any, because that was a bit of a crash course. So now that we're on the same page, and for sponsors in particular, I'm going to provide an overview of what FSC verified impact is. So in a nutshell, the procedure and verified impact more broadly is an impact demonstration framework that verifies the positive impacts of forest management on 7 ecosystem services and many types of impacts within them. And how does it work? It sets quality and integrity thresholds with reporting requirements that cover the landowners and land managers, the certificate holders in the FSC ecosystem, as well as what are the requirements for sponsors in order to credibly and responsibly engage with FSC verified impact, and the certification bodies themselves in order to credibly demonstrate and responsibly claim the positive impacts. What the procedure does is it produces quantified, externally verified, and annually audited impact claims, which are there to allow forest managers to access markets for ecosystem services and connect with organizations that are looking to support positive impacts inside or outside of their value chain. Now the scope of the procedure, sorry, one second, just a sip of water. The procedure covers 7 types of ecosystem services: biodiversity conservation, carbon, water, soil, recreation, cultural practices and values, and air quality. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many ways that people benefit from nature, many types of ecosystem services. I think that if you look at the global classification of ecosystem services, the CESIS, it's like 250 and counting, I believe. So by no means is this an exhaustive list, but this is the list within the procedure where we have the frameworks in place in order to credibly verify an impact. And underneath these 7 ecosystem services, there are 37 impact types that are eligible for verification, spread a little unevenly across them. So biodiversity, which is quite broad and complex as a term, there are 12 verifiable impacts. So things like enhancing forest cover or conserving species diversity, improving natural forest structure, or impacts that are specific to rare, threatened, or endemic species. There are 12 impacts total, also functional diversity, etc. Under carbon, there are 5, which are mainly related to whether you're maintaining or enhancing carbon stocks and which kind of management activity is contributing to that impact, whether it's afforestation or reforestation or responsible forest management or direct conservation. Watershed services are related to the maintenance or enhancement of water quality or quantity. Whereas for soil conservation, we're talking mainly about soil quality, structure, or reducing erosion. Under recreational services and cultural practices, we're talking about all of the community or social benefits that maintaining or enhancing ecosystem services can provide. So here we're talking under recreation, for example, we're talking about social, ecological benefits, local benefits from forest recreation or tourism, and engaging specifically with native species that are of interest for nature-based tourism, so that are attracting people and encouraging communities to engage with nature through charismatic species conservation, for example. There are around cultural practices, we're mainly talking about the maintenance or enhancement, the preservation of cultural or ancestral knowledges, practices, or language. And for air quality, we're talking about quantifying the clear relationship between forest cover and responsible forest management and maintaining or improving air quality nearby. All of these services are co-equal under the procedure, so certificate holders can choose to verify any eligible impacts, and sponsors can choose any service um, or any impact specifically to support. The procedure also is very flexible in terms of allowing bundling or stacking of claims. So often one set of management practices can produce multiple benefits. If you're enhancing the forest structure, there are biodiversity benefits, but there are typically also benefits related to carbon sequestration and total storage capacity. There are soil benefits, watershed services, etc. I've verified, I've supported certificate holders to verify, typically 4, 5, 6 positive impacts for different ecosystem services, all from the same project. That really depends on the project design and the objectives of your management, but it's really quite possible. And it's great because the procedure allows you to get sponsorships for specific benefits, but also for sponsors to be able to show the multiple benefits of investing in responsibly managed forests. So that's the scope. Then, as far as what the procedure produces, these claims, how can they be used? I spoke more in the last couple of sessions about how it might be relevant for forest managers. And I'm going to spend most of this session talking about the relevance for sponsors. So those that are either downstream in a forest product supply chain, as well as those outside of supply chain. So from within a supply chain, let's say you're a forest product retailer, you retail paper products or paper-based or forest product-based packaging is a really material part of your sourcing. The procedure is really useful for upstream impact assessments, for natural capital accounting, for sustainability due diligence, as well as the assessment, management, and reporting of your engagement with climate or nature-related topics. So showing how you are engaging with your supply chain, your abatement measures to avoid or reduce, say, your emissions in your supply chain. If you're having a really hard time accessing Scope 3 impact data, the procedure is a really useful tool for providing annual carbon stocking and emissions data every year in line with your disclosure requirements. It can also be used to issue or satisfy the requirements of green or sustainability linked bonds and other green financing structures. For sponsors, though, there's a more, let's say, communicable part of this, which is that the procedure and the registration of these sponsorships allow you to promote your support of verified positive impacts, both within or beyond your value chain. And this really depends on what is the sponsor's climate strategy, where do nature-based solutions fit in, which I spoke about previously, But the procedure has a lot of flexibility, and the claim system has a lot of flexibility in terms of what can be claimed and how you can fit verified impact into your sustainability strategy. I get this question all the time, so I thought it would be important just to stress the point. Verified impact claims are not the same thing as credits. They are not carbon credits or biodiversity credits or volumetric water credits or all of these other interesting new schemes that have been popping up over the last few years. But what is the difference? The main difference, the key difference, is that a credit is an environmental asset. It's something that once you buy it, you own it. Whether it's an asset or a commodity is up for debate. Some people say it's a commodity dressed as an asset, something that the ultimate goal or the reason for it being generated is that you will use it and spend it and retire it. But in any case, you own it. And that means that you can hold on to it, you can bank it until it accrues value, and then trade it. So there are typically, when we talk about crediting based systems, we have long value chains and big secondary markets with a lot of trading and speculation and banking, et cetera. The verified impact and the FSC ecosystem service procedure produces claims. These are simply verified statements of impact. They are not transferable. They are immediately retired. And because of this, they have very, very short value chains, typically direct sponsorships. And here, I really like using the procedure. I work with credit-based systems as well, but I like the procedure because it really fosters place-based or value chain-based sponsorships with a much closer relationship typically between the sponsor and the certificate holder. There are other implications of this. Typically, I think it's quite fair to say that the procedure and claims-based systems have much lower transaction costs, which I think has a lot to do with these shrinking of secondary markets and less complicated land ownership and tenure right issues. But there are other main differences. The verified impact, anytime that revenue is received from verified impacts, so if the organization, the certificate holder, the project developer, whoever it is, receives finance or financial support for the verified impact, there needs to be a revenue sharing mechanism that's in place that very clearly and hopefully fairly and equitably distributes potential revenue from ecosystem services among all the stakeholders involved in its generation. So this could be landowners, indigenous people and local communities, whoever holds the concession, the project developer, etc. It's quite flexible, but what's important is that something is written down and that it's auditable. This is typically not required under crediting systems. There are some, but generally speaking, the financing structure or the revenue structure is very open and very broad. I think another main difference, and it's an important one, is credits are quite fixed in what methodologies they allow for demonstrating these impacts, and also quite fixed in what kind of impacts or claims can be made based on them. Whereas the procedure is more flexible and I think a lot more fit for purpose in terms of what kind of claim are you trying to make and how can sponsors engage early in the impact demonstration process to demonstrate, to make sure that there's a lot of coherence between what the sponsor needs and how the impact is measured and demonstrated. Now for sponsors in particular, and how is it relevant? What are the key components in the procedure that are relevant for sponsors? There's a few, and first it's probably important to talk about what are the nuts and bolts of the ecosystem services claim. And the procedure is pretty specific about what information needs to be in any ecosystem services claim. So it needs to cover the specific ES impact, the geographic location of the management unit where the impact was generated, so at least at the national level. What is the year of validation or verification, and what are the years that are covered under the impact demonstration? And this might take the form, I took a quick shot from the revised procedure that shows an example. And so here sponsors can say that there's, which sponsor specifically is sponsoring which specific forest in which country, which contributes to, for example, the maintenance of intact forest landscapes in a defined time period. And the idea here being that it's as open and transparent as possible, what impact is being generated, for how long, by whom, and with whose support. There are additional requirements for sponsors, and especially around how they can make claims. So the claims need to be clearly separated from other statements that are not verified under the FSC system. This is especially important if sponsors are using ES claims toward their sustainability targets. So it just needs to be very clearly separated when you're talking about your overall strategy or action plan, which are the claims that are verifiable by FSC and which are not, and out of that scope. There are clear rules around avoiding the exaggeration, misuse, misrepresentation, or false information related to ecosystem services claims. In a word, greenwashing. And I'll talk more in a second about how FSC works with sponsors to ensure the responsible use of claims. And this is quite important. If a sponsor wants to attribute the impact to their financial support, if they want to say, this impact would not have been possible or only happened because of my sponsorship, that's possible under the procedure. But there are additionality tests that are required to be carried out to show that the impact would not have happened without that financial support. So those are the requirements around making a claim. There are broader requirements that are specific to sponsors. And this is, again, sort of a nuts and bolts, but in order for sponsors to publicly register their sponsorships in the FSC registry, they'll need to have a written agreement with the certificate holders or the organization outlining the scope and terms of the sponsorship. And that needs to be included in the auditing process. They'll also need a sponsorship registration agreement with FSC in order to publicly register their claims. Now, in order to make forgive me, that's just to publicly register the sponsorship. Then in order to make claims, any sponsor who's trying to make ES claims, like I was just showing on the previous slide, will need to have a promotional license agreement with FSC. And this is quite a big change from the previous procedure, which was very, very open in terms of what kind of claims could be made and how they could be tracked. Now sponsors will need to work more closely with, especially with national offices, to structure their ES claims and how they communicate them. They also will need to demonstrate their adherence to the mitigation hierarchy, which I showed before. So specific to the ES, the ecosystem service that they're sponsoring. So if a company is trying to make a climate claim using verified impact, they'll need to show that they have a climate strategy and a climate target. And they'll need to outline what actions they're taking to avoid and minimize their impacts, and which they're taking to offset or contribute positive impacts outside their value chain. So that's something that FSC will have to evaluate on a sponsor by sponsor basis as well. As far as sponsors that have a material dependence on forests, so this is especially retailers of forest-based products, etc. They are encouraged to adopt an FSC-aligned procurement policy or obtain chain of custody certification within 12 months. That's less relevant, obviously, for companies that are not engaged materially with forest products. But for any that are, as part of the abatement process, it's important for them to align with the rest of FSC's forest management values. And the idea being that with all of these sort of procedural aspects in place, that the procedure can be used to help support corporates on their journey toward net zero and nature positive all along the mitigation hierarchy. And the procedure, because of its flexibility, because of its broad scope, is really effective at helping companies engage with their supply chain to, for example, or if they are directly engaged in forest operations, to verify their baseline impact. So what is their environmental footprint? If they're talking about their emissions, what is their carbon footprint before they implement a plan or set targets, or what do they need to know in order to establish a baseline? And then through each of the processes, so whether they're going through the avoidance phase, where they're looking to substitute some of their more emissions heavy products or materials with bioeconomic materials like wood, for example, as well as within their value chain in order to reduce their impacts. How are they optimizing their supply chain, their procurement strategy, who they're engaging with? And how can they show that they're either showing preference for organizations that are managing their forests for carbon stocking on top of other considerations, or how are they engaging directly with their sourcing areas to reduce emissions from their supply chain, all the way through the abatement process, all the way to the neutralization, where the procedure can be paired with other crediting schemes to enhance the value of carbon credits or other external environmental attribute certification frameworks. Now, what's important here, and I thought this was worth taking a moment to emphasize, but I'll try to move through it relatively quickly for questions. So when we talk about verified impact in, say, a corporate climate strategy, so for companies that are pursuing climate neutral or net zero targets, it's worth emphasizing that the verified impact is best suited for either verified impact data, so say scope 3 measurement and reporting, as well as emissions reductions within your supply chain. Verified impact FSC does not allow offsetting or neutralization claims, and that's really important, especially for companies outside of forest product value chains. And I thought it'd be worth visualizing this. If you look on the left, this figure here is a climate neutral and net zero journey for an organization. This is from ISO under their carbon neutral claims standard. And what you can see here is sort of above the middle line, companies are expected to establish a baseline. So what are their business as usual greenhouse gas emissions? And then reduce those emissions over time and as much as possible. The benchmark is typically 90% by 2040, 2045, let's say. And then because of technological limitations or simply the materials or commodities that they're working with, there will often be residual greenhouse gas emissions that companies cannot avoid or reduce. And these they're expected to neutralize by supporting projects outside of their supply chain. Now, the procedure is really good at handling those projects above the line. So either for measuring the baseline or showing an emissions reduction inside the supply chain. What it cannot be used for is either offsetting claims. So that's the on the bottom half of the middle line. So reductions or offsets from year one of a climate plan, all the way through the removals or neutralization of residual emissions. The procedure does not allow for any claims in this space. under the current version. Now, there is a working group that's being put together to explore what would be required in order to make these types of claims, but for the moment, those are not permitted under the current procedure. So if you're an organization, a sponsor, a corporate or financial institution that's looking on climate strategies, again, typically verified impact is very, very well suited toward measuring your baseline, tracking your emissions reduction progress over time. And what's really important, and I think this is important from the beginning, is because the procedure is really flexible in terms of its metrics and indicators, it's really important. I say this for any project and any sponsorship, for organizations to align how they're measuring their pressures. So how are companies, let's say an agri-food company, is measuring their impacts on climate change, on pollution, on land resource use, on land use, etc. And what are the indicators and metrics that they're using to measure their pressures and how they're reducing them over time? It's really important to align those with how a project or a forest manager is measuring their positive impacts. And what's important here, I'll give an example. I see all the time that companies are measuring their water consumption, but they're supporting projects that are mainly measuring improvements in water quality. And while that's a noble cause, it creates a lot of problems in coherence and alignment when the company wants to show that they're reducing their water withdrawal impacts because the metrics and indicators just simply aren't aligned. And the procedure is very flexible in terms of what kind of claims, indicators, metrics are allowed. And typically, I think the main way to head that off is for sponsors to engage early with certificate holders prior to verification to ensure that there's a strong coherence between what kind of claims they're making from sponsorship and how the positive impacts were actually measured. So I'll run through these very quickly. But I think everybody hopefully got the key messages here around the procedure producing very robust impact statements, which are underpinned by the best in class, globally recognized social, environmental, and economic safeguards. For sponsors, there's a lot of opportunity for registering their financial support of these impacts and using them to make claims, as long as certain integrity criteria are met. For example, no offsetting claims, and with a clear adherence to the mitigation hierarchy. And accordingly, the procedure is most suited for abatement claims within forest supply chains. And it's good to know from the beginning that sponsors will be working closely with FSC around the public registration and communication of their sponsorship claims. And again, while one of the greatest strengths of verified impact is its adaptability, it really emphasizes the need or the best practice for sponsors to engage with forest managers early in the process to ensure that all of these metrics, indicators, whether additionality is required or attribution is desired, etc., are aligned from the beginning. I think that's it. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think we have a few minutes at least. I don't know if we have any questions.
Yeah, we got at least one question in the chat, Wesley. Thank you very much for doing this for us. You're a wealth of knowledge, and it really shows through your presentations. Oh, and coming to us at 7 o'clock at night from your home is also very nice. Thank
No
you.
worries, Todd. My pleasure.
Oh, we had a question from Jake. He says, "What is the frequency of verification for any given impact?" I think he's talking.
Yeah.
I think, Jake, you're talking about audit frequency. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Jake. The short answer is minimum every 5 years. And if anything material changes in the impact demonstration process, if there's a major management intervention or a change in the way that the impact is measured, then it will need to be verified again. But otherwise, once every 5 years.
And I think also, Wesley, if I remember correctly, if you're and specifically for Jake, as he manages a group, if you have a lot of new group members wanting to participate with the procedure, then that would also trigger an audit, would it not?
Yes, it would. Yeah.
Okay.
So if there's any major material change to the impact, like you said, if a new member comes in that wants to be verified, if there's a major change in the state or condition of the forest or in the management, if there's a natural disaster, if there's anything that could impact the quantity or amount or quality of the demonstrated impact, then it'll need to be verified again. But as a baseline, it's every 5 years.
Great, thanks. Appreciate that.
Sure.
I had a couple other questions for you. Um, do you have a ballpark estimate of the size, like the scope 3 market worldwide? Is there a lot of people doing this or just a couple? I mean, who's
The
really
scope
diving
three
into scope
market.
3? Yeah,
Yeah, that's a very good question. The issue with estimating the size of that market is that it's really decentralized, and it typically takes place in a very we're talking typically about pretty sensitive information, but that's business data that's between um, a buyer and a supplier, right? Uh, so it's difficult for me to give you an aggregate amount. What is the total size of that market? What I can say is that there's been a tremendous push in the last 2 to 5 years, both at a policy level and at a voluntary level, to emphasize supply chain engagement first. And so when companies who are doing this to meet, like, say, a climate target, it's no longer really sufficient to say, oh, we made a promise for 2050, and in the meantime, we're offsetting all of our emissions from year one. There really needs to be a clear supply chain engagement strategy. And so what's good about that is we're no longer talking about, let's say, like a carbon credit market or what's the total, let's say, voluntary credit market. We're talking about total climate finance and capital allocation in the forest sector, which is a much bigger slice. I think that would be available to certificate holders.
one quick question. With an FSC audit, you have your normal FM audit. Of course, that's a prerequisite. But then getting back to Jake's question, that one minimum once every 5-year audit, is that like a 6-day audit or a 1-day audit, or what kind of intensity should the certificate holder expect?
Well, the intensity will be scaled to the I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing
Okay.
in the FM, but to the scale, intensity, or risk. It's a risk-based approach,
Okay.
same as the FM certification. Now, what I can say is we did a study on the time and cost burden of ecosystem services auditing relative to FM, and it's very minor typically compared, actually not typically in every instance compared to the FM certification. So I would say anywhere from half a day, a couple of hours minimum, to maximum a day and a half extra, even for the largest organizations.
Excellent. Well, we're at time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I just want to give you another round of thanks. And we really appreciate you agreeing to do this and help us out and kind of guide us through the wilderness here. This is a new and emerging market. So just want to say thank you again for you and for your team. And thank you for everybody who attended the webinars. If you attended, but you had a colleague that couldn't attend, make sure you send them the links that we're going to have out for you for the recordings and for the slideshows. And that'll just be really helpful to get us spread the word, as it's just a very new market in the US, and just trying to get this out as wide as possible. So thanks you all for attending too. I really appreciate it, and look out for an email from us towards the end of the week, hopefully by Friday, if not early next week, with all the links. So thanks everybody out.